arguing that there was no trade between Europe and East Asia in the early Middle Ages. So, honestly, for me, I would probably just stop even right there. I'd probably be like, okay, so somebody's arguing that there was no trade between Europe and East Asia in the early Middle Ages. Got it. So no one, I'm just imagining like a trail, right? No one's going back and forth. Okay. Making that argument because there are no written records of such a trade is like arguing that the Yeti. I paused there for a second. I was like, really? You're gonna make a comparison to arguing about a Yeti? An ape-like creature supposedly existing in the Himalayas does not exist because there have been no scientifically confirmed sightings. Okay, so arguing this one thing is like arguing this other thing. Does this person sound like they are in favor or against this idea?
Against.
They're against it, right? Like someone's arguing that there was no trade, and this person's like, no, that's a horrible argument. A verifiable sighting of the Yeti would prove that the creature does exist, but the absence of sightings cannot prove that it does not. Okay, I agree. That's something that the LSAT tests over and over again. I would be skeptical though, because I'd be like, no written evidence. That seems like it's okay. I agree that it can't be proven, but that's being really nitpicky. But maybe this argument's not so bad. We know that the last sentence is evidence because it's talking about the Yeti, and this conclusion is ultimately about trade, right? So the conclusion here was never actually said. They were just saying, arguing like this, making this argument in this way is like making this other argument, and by the way, that other argument sucks. Implication, the first argument sucks. Okay. Which one of the following best expresses the point of the argument? This is unusual because the main conclusion is not explicitly stated, but we do know what the person was trying to prove. So I would go into the answer choices looking for something like that. Like, hey, saying that there was no trade just because there's no written evidence is not a great argument. This person isn't saying that there was trade. They're just saying that we don't know that there wasn't. Right? You guys catch the difference there? Okay. So, A, evidence for the existence of trade between Europe and East Asia in the early Middle Ages is, like the evidence for the existence of the Yeti, not scientifically confirmed. This is weird because we don't have evidence for the existence. We have a lack of evidence for the existence, right? So this is not what we're looking for. B, in order to prove in the early Middle Ages that there was trade, it is necessary to find both Asian and European evidence that such trade existed. In order to prove that there was trade, no, we're talking about proving that there wasn't trade. So again, this is not what we're talking about. C, the trade between Europe and East Asia did not exist in the early Middle Ages, that trade does not exist, cannot be established simply by the absence of a certain sort of evidence that this trade existed. Yeah, it can't be established. Maybe it's true, but it can't be established simply by the absence of evidence. That's what this argument was trying to say. So I would keep this one open. D, the view that there was trade between Europe and East Asia in the early Middle Ages can only be disproved. It wasn't the view that there was trade, it was the view that there wasn't trade. So again, I'm not even going to read the rest of this answer. E, there is no more evidence. There is no more evidence that trade between Europe and East Asia existed in the early Middle Ages than there is that the Yeti existed. There was a comparison in here, but it wasn't about how much evidence each one had, so this is out. So the answer's got to be C. Are we cool with what happened here? This is a little unusual because there is no explicit main conclusion. We had to deduce it from the two claims that were made. 13. Which of the following considerations, if true, best counters the argument? Anyone know what type of question this is? It's a weaken question because we're asked to counter. So it says which one of the following considerations, if true, that means that you have to accept all 5 answer choices as true. Can anyone figure out what these 5 answer choices could be called, given the names that we just talked about? They are premises, but,
Assumptions.
well, okay, interesting, because assumptions were not said, right? But this is something that's going to counter the argument. So this is a counter premise. This is something that's going against the conclusion. A premise technically supports the conclusion, and an assumption technically supports the conclusion because it's just an unstated premise. So these are 5 counter premises, and again, we haven't talked about this at all, but I'm just curious what your gut tells you. Are you looking for an answer choice that's strongly worded or weakly worded? By a strongly worded answer choice, I mean something like always or usually or only versus a weakly worded answer like sometimes, occasionally. Why strongly?
Because it's asking the best choice.
Yeah, it's asking for the one that's going to counter the argument the most. So if you're thinking of yourself as a prosecutor and you're trying to counter someone else's argument, right? You want the strongest piece of evidence you can get. You can't, if you got some evidence that sometimes this guy goes to that 7-Eleven, that's not as helpful as that guy's there every freaking day, right? So that's more helpful. Now, that said, this is one of those question types in which you do have a sliding scale. So one answer choice may weaken the argument, and another answer choice may weaken it even more. And then you pick the one that weakens it the most, whereas in some question types, there is no sliding scale. It's either right or wrong. Like, that's what we see in games all the time. All the answer choices in games are either right or wrong. There's no like, oh, well, D was better, right? Like, it's just wrong or right. But in this case, we do have a sliding scale, so we may see some answer choices that do weaken, but not as much as others. A, most of the evidence for the existence of trade. So first of all, you have to get clear in your mind, what are you trying to weaken here? Ultimately, the conclusion, and the conclusion was C, okay? It was C. No, the conclusion, you want to get it in your head in like plain English, that way as you're going through the answer choices, you know what you're going against. So in my head, I'm thinking, oh, this guy said that just because there was no written records doesn't mean that there wasn't trade. So we want an answer choice that says, yeah, no written records is a big deal. That means there wasn't trade. So if we can look for an answer choice that suggests that, then that's the answer. Okay, A, most of the evidence for the existence of trade between Europe and East Asia in the early Middle Ages is archaeological and therefore does not rely on written records. This helps the argument. It says, look, written records doesn't mean anything. It doesn't rely on written records, right? We need something that says, yes, it relies on written records. Therefore, if you don't have any written records, that's a big deal. B, although written records of trade in East Asia in the early Middle Ages survived, there are almost no European documents from that period that mention trade at all. Okay, what did the East Asia records say? We don't know. This is consistent with the argument. Just because they don't mention it doesn't mean that there wasn't trade. So I would keep going. Any trade between Europe and East Asia in the early Middle Ages would necessarily have been of very low volume and would have involved high-priced items. Okay, so if there was trade, it wouldn't have happened that much. Okay, was there trade? I don't know. Was anyone tempted by this answer? Doesn't talk about the evidence. D, there have been no confirmed sightings of the Yeti. I'm really inclined to stop right here, because I don't really care what's true about the Yeti. Now, it's true that the argument did rest on an analogy, so I'm going to keep going, but I'm inclined to think this is probably wrong. But there is indirect evidence, such as footprints, which, if it is accepted as authentic, would establish the Yeti's existence. Do we have indirect evidence for the trade? We don't know. It doesn't talk about it, right? So because this is talking about the Yeti, I don't think it's that relevant. E, there are surviving European and East Asian written records from the early Middle Ages that do not mention trade between the two regions, but would have been very likely to do so if this trade had existed. Okay, and it doesn't mention it, so that strongly suggests that maybe there wasn't trade. Now, one thing about this answer choice, does this disprove the conclusion? No, it just weakens it. So the conclusion still could be true, but it doesn't. It does weaken it because it's like, yeah, maybe the lack of written evidence is evidence that there wasn't truth.